powerful discussion on the impacts of policing on Black women and women of color. A discussion between women that have done so much to deepen our commitment and our capacity to fight back against state violence. So thank you for joining us here, and thank you so much to this amazing space, NAVEL. One of our past CRLA members, Gloria Galvez, introduced us to this space, and we're really happy to be here tonight, so thank you. My name is Eva Nagao, and I'm a volunteer member with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and also Critical Resistance Los Angeles. Amazing organizations here. I'm going to talk a little bit about critical resistance and then introduce our lineup of speakers. So for those of you who are new, Critical Resistance, or CR, is a national grassroots organization building a movement to end the reliance on the interlocking systems of imprisonment, surveillance, and policing, what we call the Prison Industrial Complex, or the PIC, as a response to political, social, and economic problems, a very tidy definition. We do this through campaigns, projects, and culture and education at events like this. Our approach combines organizing and advocacy to dismantle current structures of imprisonment and policing, changing how communities and decision makers understand punishment and safety, and building new institutions and practices to transform and prevent interpersonal, communal, and social harm. Our local chapter, CRLA, as you can see all of our amazing members at the tables back here, have been fighting jail expansion. Have been fighting jail expansion in Los Angeles since 2004 and shifting common sense from imprisonment and state violence to health and well-being through campaigns against jails and prisons, projects with formerly imprisoned people, health workers, social workers, artists, educators, to name a few, and grassroots education. Tonight, we are thrilled to host author and attorney, educator, and organizer, Andrea Ritchie, author of Visible No More, in conversation. In conversation with Romarilyn Ralston for California Coalition for Women Prisoners and many more, and Ivette Alé for California's United for Responsible Budget. And a welcome to anyone who's here for the Curb face-to-face this weekend. We're really excited to be part of that and presenting, and just really excited that all these partners from all over the state are here this weekend. So this conversation is especially important coming on the heels of a huge campaign pitch in our fight against jail expansion in Los Angeles. With our movement partners in LA No More Jails from 2004 to 2016, and from the Justice LA Coalition from 2017 to present, yes, Justice LA, we just celebrated the defeat of the proposed Mira Loma Women's Jail Construction Plan. To celebrate so many people and so many years of effort. The future of LA is here. So at the same time, however, at the same campaign mobilization, LA decision makers passed a gender-responsive jailing motion. Yeah, okay. What is that? So they also passed this replacement project for the men's central jail under the guise of a mental health facility. So we're so grateful to have all these amazing women, all these amazing partners pushing against and continuing this fight against imprisonment and criminalization. Supervisor Solis really adopting language and using kind of words from the movement in a good way, said a jail is a jail is a jail. We're here and we're still fighting and we're still plotting and we're still organizing to make sure that this mental health treatment facility isn't a jail. So we want to make sure that we meet community needs with self-determined resources. So we hope tonight gets you ready to keep fighting for liberation, to fight the violence and criminalization, and together we believe that's possible. We believe we can defeat this jail that's not a jail and that we can work towards abolition. This evening, Andrea will give a presentation on Invisible No More. Then we'll be joined by conversation with Romarilyn and Ivette. After the discussion, there will be a book signing. So please pick up a copy of the book and stick around for the talk. Now, I'd like to welcome Danielle Dupuy, who will be introducing Andrea. We're excited to have Danielle here with us to provide local insight into the importance of data, research, and strategic public health-informed approaches to community organizing. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. as Eva mentioned, I work with data. I'm also the co-director of $1 Million Hoods, where we collect policing and arrest data from law enforcement agencies around California to really map the human and fiscal costs of policing and incarceration. We do that in collaboration with community. Tonight I have the awesome honor of introducing Andrea, which I'm really thrilled about. But before I do that formally, I just want to touch on the importance of her work to me as a data person and as a public health advocate. So I just want to say that the work that she put into this, it gives the data that we look at meaning. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, $1 Million Hoods just released a report on women incarcerated in LA County Jail. And that report was used as evidence to stop the construction of the women's jail in Mira Loma, right? But it's not just that data that could have moved policymakers. It's really the accounts, the personal, historical, current accounts of women that face these atrocities every day that really helped give the data context and meaning. So, for example, when I look at the data for $1 Million Hoods and I see that among the top charges against Black women is prostitution, but among no other women of other races, the accounts from Andrea's book help provide understanding of why that might be, what that really means, right? And as a public health person, the stories that I read, they just really hit home. So as a public health advocate, I believe in holistic well-being, right? So your physical well-being affects your mental, affects your emotional and spiritual well-being. They're all intertwined. You cannot be physically well without being mentally well. You cannot be mentally well without being emotionally well, so on and so forth, right? And violence is a public health issue, right? So when I read that the very things that public health professionals promote to help people's physical well-being, such as condom use, is also criminalized and traumatizing people, at the same time it really makes me take a new look at what I'm doing as a public health person, right? And how I need to really critically think about those things and how what public health is advocating for can also be used to criminalize people. So just with all of that being said, I want to thank Andrea for her work, her advocacy, for, I know, the years of effort that was put into this, for help giving us perspective, and what I know must have been an emotionally jarring journey to go through all of these accounts of women historically and today. So with that being said, she asked that I not actually read off her entire bio, but I will say that she's pretty amazing. I have to just say a few things, right? Because it's awesome. Go here. So, she is a police misconduct attorney and a 2014 Senior Soros Justice Fellow with more than 2 decades of experience advocating against police violence and the criminalization of women and LGBTQ people of color. She's also currently a researcher, an advocate. I won't go into all the details, but she's basically dope. So with that being said, let's welcome her up.
That was the best intro ever. I'm also suddenly extremely nervous because so many of my sheros and queeros are in the room, and I didn't expect them to be here, and many of them are part of writing this book, and you'll hear more about them, but just to shout out Elisa Vieria from Insight, whose thinking is foundational to the work that went into this book and who I've learned so much from over the years. Ivette Alé from UCLA, who helped me litigate against some of the issues that I raised in the book. And Sarah Haley will tell you more about in a second, who's probably making me most nervous. Okay. So I just want to thank all of you for having me here, Jess, for your persistence in making it happen. We've been working on this for, I think, over a year. And just thank Critical Resistance for all of the ways it has challenged me and shaped my analysis and action over 2 decades, and also to thank the CRLA chapter, who's inspired me for over a decade since I first learned about your work when I was an advisor to an abolitionist funder, and one of your grants was up, and I was like, whoa, that's real work. That's what I think we should be supporting. I'm also super excited to be here in LA. There is so much of LA in this book, both in terms of the stories that I gathered starting in 2003, 2004 when I was researching an Amnesty International report here, but also so much of the I learned from organizers during that time and since then. And I currently work with groups around the country challenging policing and criminalization, and almost always I'm pointing them to LA for examples of how to really bust things open and challenge the whole process around police violence, criminalization, and punishment. So I'm just so grateful for all that I've learned from all of you, from CR, from CRLA, and to be here to celebrate the legacy and build towards the next 20 years. Before I go any further, I just want to give a healthy trigger warning. We're in a festive environment, and I'm going to be talking about hard things. I'm going to be talking about physical and sexual violence, and sometimes using words that police officers use to illustrate the dynamics that are at play. And I am a Black woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm an immigrant, I'm a survivor of interpersonal and state violence, and I'm also mindful of what the impact might be of hearing some of these things coming from someone who looks like me. And I'm also mindful of making visible what has been invisible for so long, even when it's been happening right in front of our faces, but not doing so in a way that reproduces images of Black death and violation in ways that contribute to dehumanization instead of challenging it. And I probably don't always get that right, and so I just really welcome folks' feedback after tonight's program on how I might do that better. But in the meantime, I really encourage you all to take care of yourselves during the presentation and step out or have a cigarette or whatever you need while it's happening. So, and I also am going to move through this quickly because I'm excited for the conversation to come, and that's actually the best part. But one of the things I work to make visible and call into question in the book is the history and process of criminalization and the narratives that fuel it. And that would not have been possible for me to do without the work of Sarah Haley, whose, a book, No Mercy Here, you just have to go get right now or after this program. Because it does so much and so beautifully, illustrates the history of criminalization and the narratives and stories of Black women that fuel it, the ways in which Black women resisted it, and just in a way that inspired me throughout this book to strive somewhere near as good and beautiful and eloquent a writer, but also to be so dedicated to telling these stories with respect and care. Like literally every day I was like, I have to aim there, even if I never get there. And also for really conclusively putting paid to the notion that the criminal legal system in the United States was created to control the bodies and labor of Black men, and that everyone else is collateral damage, which is a theory that, believe it or not, is still being put out today. And it's so such a blessing and a gift to be able to slam down No Mercy Here and be like, read this and we'll talk later. So, so I think the basic version of this is that even as laws change and criminalizing narratives travel through time and context, they continue to target the same populations through the same controlling narratives and in service of the same ideologies and relations of power. And we're certainly seeing that in the current political climate, where criminalization is the major tool being used by the current administration and its allies to advance every aspect of the right-wing white supremacist agenda, using the very same stories that are rooted in slavery and colonialism and imperialism that have been driving criminalization since its inception. The book also tries to make visible the many institutions driving and contributing to criminalization. Criminalization has infected every single institution, every single aspect of our life. It is society's primary, if not only, response to every form of harm, every conflict, every issue. And for many communities and people, is their first and only contact, sometimes with the state, and the only resource available when people are in need of help. And so what that means is that criminalization is happening through institutions we think of, like policing, parole, probation, immigration enforcement, but it's also happening through institutions we see as helping institutions, like education, schools, hospitals, foster care, etc. And that it's not only happening along the axes of identities that we think of, like race and poverty and maybe immigration status, but also that criminalization is about establishing and maintaining gender binaries and hierarchies. It's about controlling sexuality and reproduction, and that it operates along many identities. So as indicated by the title of the book, what I'm working to do is unseat the invisibility of women's experiences of incarceration, which have led to a 700% growth in people incarcerated in women's prison over the past 4 decades, and a 14-fold growth in incarceration of people in women's jails over the same period. So often we think of there's a smaller number of women maybe doing hard time or long time, but women are doing maybe as much time, just in smaller stints in jails in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, a year, and under conditions, as many people involved in the jail fight know, it's hard to say which is worse, right? Prisons are awful and torturous, and jails have even less stuff or resources available, and often horrifying conditions. So it's been about countering the invisibility of these patterns, but also the policing practices that drive them. It's about reminding people that Black women are still incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. And how many of you have read the new Jim Crow or seen the 13th? So you know that 1 in 3 Black men face incarceration in their lifetime, and that's what's been driving a lot of the work. You might not know that 1 in 2 Black trans women experience incarceration in their lifetime. That number also has to drive our work. You probably know that the vast majority of people incarcerated in women's prisons are mothers, often of minor children, often the sole caregiver at the time of arrest, and often for minor offenses, but might lose custody or serve a life sentence of parental termination as a result. You may not know that 42% of people incarcerated in women's prisons identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, gender nonconforming, or same-gender loving before they were incarcerated. That's a gross disproportion to our representation of the population. I wish it was equal, but it's not. And so we need to attend to how lesbians and bi and queer and gender nonconforming people are being criminalized in ways that we aren't yet. And also to the fact that people with disabilities are disproportionately criminalized, and that jail and prison is disabling. And that both of those things produce the fact that almost half of the people in women's jails have one kind of disability or another. And a third to 40% of people in prisons and jails of all genders. Why does this matter? Because Black women matter, because Indigenous women matter, because Asian women matter, but also because if we don't pay attention to the full scope of the problem, we don't get to the full solution. So by focusing on 1 in 3 Black men who have been incarcerated in their lifetime as the dominant narrative of policing and criminalization, we have started to see a decrease in the number of people in men's prisons. But in many states, it's been completely overshadowed, overcome by the increase in the number of people in women's prisons. So if we want to get everyone out of cages, we're going to have to pay attention to how everyone is criminalized. Invisible No More also calls attention to the people who never make it to a cage, and the ways in which criminalizing narratives, policing, and punishment produce long lists of Black women and women of color and queer and trans people of color who have been killed by police. It also attends to how criminalization happens in ways that, again, may not produce an arrest number or an incarceration number, but produce a stop, a harassment, a frisk, a humiliation, a degradation, an interference with your ability to go to school, go to work, live your daily life. And to the fact that the racial disparities in those stops, even if LAPD doesn't track them this way, are often identical among stops of women as they are among stops of men. And that often in those stops, there are gender and sexuality specific things that happen. Whether it is in the case of the person who's pictured here, who was doing a double shift at a hospital, much like the one around the corner here, and when they stopped her to frisk her, the police dumped her purse out on the sidewalk. And she'd done double shifts, so she had a change of underwear, she had some birth control, she had some menstrual products, and they proceeded to pick them all up and parade them in front of everyone and humiliate her about them and ask her questions about them, and then drop it all and walk away, because of course they found nothing. That's a consequence of criminalization that we don't talk about, but also let's think about what does that say to the people who are standing around her when she's left, and what does that do for her safety when the police have made it so clear that they're not going to protect her and how they see her and perceive her. There are times when stops lead to strip searches and cavity searches, as they did for Ivette Alé, who after a traffic stop for supposedly rolling through a stop sign, was publicly and violently and forcibly strip searched and cavity searched for 11 minutes at a gas station in Houston by the side of the road. Those charges were dropped. She didn't do the time in the cage. She's not going to be in those numbers. But she experienced a violent public sexual assault by a police officer. And unfortunately, that is how the war on drugs is waged on the bodies of Black women in ways that we don't talk about enough. Sexual violence, in fact, is a central aspect of policing. It is part of how policing happens. Policing is sexual violence, and we're having a national conversation about sexual violence right now, in which somehow we're not looking at people who have more power over more people on a daily basis than Harvey Weinstein ever did, and use the power in the exact same way that he did. And so Monique Morris and I just published this last week to really not only put out some new messaging and frames around this conversation, but also to offer ways in which both Tarana Burke and many Black women and Black people-led organizations are advancing non-carceral responses that are focused on healing and justice for survivors and actual prevention as opposed to incarceration. So in the interest of time, I won't run through all of the statistics. I could tell you about this. They're all in the book, which you can pick up. But it's the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct after excessive force, but not the second most frequently talked about in this moment. And this is Norm Stamper, who was the police chief in Seattle, talking about this actually being a well-known secret in law enforcement. And that officers target people who are criminalized. This is a consequence of criminalization that, again, is not reflected in the numbers of arrests and mass incarceration or stops. But it is, once you deem the population criminalized, you can do anything you want to them, and the police act exactly that way. They treat people who are criminalized as if they're their property and they're inviolable and they are completely subject to sexual violence. And that it happens during traffic stops, but also in schools and during youth engagement programs. So often when people say, oh, we just need to get the police and the community together and build back community trust and have baseball games or community engagement programs, in 1 year, 38% of all sexual assaults by police officers that were reported took place in community engagement programs, in youth explorer programs, in ride-alongs that young people were doing with police officers. So that's not going to work to end sexual violence. And obviously it's something that's happening, literally the border is being enforced on women and trans people's bodies in the form of sexual violence by Border Patrol and ICE agents in the interior, as well as law enforcement who know that undocumented people can't hold them accountable without putting themselves at risk. Of course, stops produce the kinds of violence that we are accustomed to seeing male-bodied people in this position, but this is a position that women and trans folks find themselves in every day, whether it's a traffic stop or, in the case of Marlene Pinnock, a beating by the side of the road, which, while y'all turned up and organized around Marlene's case and made it possible for her to achieve some measure of accountability, we didn't see the same uprising across the country as we did for Rodney King with a very similar video, and so really calling on us to resist, as you all did here nationwide, whether it was the deadly stop of Riddell Jones that led you all to shut down City Hall for 50 days, or just the ongoing work that you're doing to cop watch and end those kinds of stops. Invisible No More sort of reminds us that these things start early in school, and that these statistics, as Danielle was saying, are real stories involving real people, and that there's real resistance where this is ground zero. And I've been following the work of Youth Justice LA for a very long time, and the folks at Dignity in Schools, and know that organizers around the country are learning from that work, and I get to talk about it in the book. In terms of what's driving that 700% increase or that 1,400% increase, we know that there's some sort of basic buckets, and I talk about them in the book, how policing and the war on drugs is driving mass incarceration of Black women and women of color, and it definitely is doing that for Indigenous women as well. and talking about how the methods of the current administration are increasing and intensifying, are likely to produce not only continued increase, but also continued violence and placing women at risk, and that people are resisting and continue to resist. I would say that LA is the place where I learned, maybe only second to New York, the most about broken windows policing. One of the first stories I wrote about was the 1999 killing of who was basically killed because of broken windows policing. She was pushing a shopping cart in the street. That's considered a sign of disorder under broken windows theory. Police approached her and shot her dead in front of people who were telling them in no uncertain terms that she posed no risk. And I've since heard from and learned from the work of LA Can on Skid Row about how homeless people are targeted. I've learned from queer and trans people in Hollywood and West Hollywood how they're targeted pursuant to broken windows policing. And I've heard from people on every stroll in the city about how broken windows policing creates the possibility, and also from gay men, about how lewd conduct, which is part of broken windows policing charges, create the possibility for police officers to literally enforce lines of gender, sex, sexuality, race, nation, and class on any person at any moment, because they have so many defenses with which to do that, and they use them to that end. And I've also learned in LA about what the struggle to resist broken windows policing looks like, and how we can learn from that and bring it around the country. And I've certainly learned about the criminalization of survivors of violence here in Los Angeles, whether they're migrant survivors, trans survivors, survivors involved in sex trades, lesbian survivors, and also there's a lot of data about how mandatory arrest policies, which are sort of part of a carceral feminist response to violence in the home, have actually contributed to increased arrests of survivors from all of those populations. I learned a great deal about that here in LA, and I've also been lucky just even this past weekend to learn from organizers from Survived and Punished California about how they're resisting that, not just in case-by-case campaigns like the one to free Leah, which if you do nothing else tonight, if you, like everything I'm saying is just blah, 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 just go to freeleah.org and please call on Governor Newsom to commute or offer clemency to Leah Dara, who is an Ethiopian migrant who married a US service person, was taken to rural California and abused for years, and one day defended her life when she thought it was ending. And unfortunately wasn't able to benefit from the law that you all worked so hard to pass in California, that the fact that someone's a survivor of violence should be considered when someone is being charged with a violent offense. And it's because of the very narratives that Sarah Haley writes about in her book, is that black folks, black women particularly, are seen as inviolable and inherently monstrous, threatening, deranged, and prone to violence. That the judge literally said, I don't believe you're a survivor of violence, and therefore wasn't giving her that clemency. And then when she appealed, someone who's running for president said, I don't believe you either. And so she did 6 years, stepped out of the jail, and into immigration detention, where she sits now and needs Governor Newsom to free her. So please get him to free her tonight. But also inspired by the campaign that Survived and Punished is doing to do mass commutations, to not just have to do case-by-case organizing, but just say, we need to free all the survivors and we need to free them now. And realize that 93% of people in women's prisons are the person they committed harm against, or that they were convicted of committing harm against, abused them, or they experienced abuse from them before. So this is about actually freeing most people inside who are incarcerated. And then we have to stop people from going into cages at all. And again, I've learned so much from CR and LA organizers about strategies for decriminalization of street vending, decriminalization of broken windows offenses, decriminalization of homelessness, decriminalization of sex work, decriminalization of unmet mental health needs, of everything. That this is the place that LA starts, because we need to stop people from having to be in cages. And then once they're in cages, we have to buy their freedom so that they can not lose custody of their kids, so that they can have a chance at remaining healthy and be able to fight their charges. And that we have to stop building jails that house people, and that's another way we're going to keep people free, and that we're going to be mindful of who's in there, and that this is not where you're going to get mental health treatment, and that you're going to use research to fight to win. Thank you, Danielle. And then I've learned so much here in LA over the years from everyone from Homies Unidos to CRLA to so many folks about the importance of really not just rupture and collaboration with immigration enforcement, but cop watching and doing, using text messaging and all kinds of other strategies to protect each other, to say, there's a traffic, roadblock here, everyone go around it. I mean, those things started in LA, those things are things that people are still learning from around the country. And the last part of the book, and the reason I get up in the morning, is that for me, conversations about policing and criminalization ultimately are conversations about what kind of society we want to build and live in, and how we want to respond to and transform harm, and where we want to put our resources, what we want to invest in, how we want to live. Do we want to send one person to juvenile detention facility or 50 people to college? Do we want to send one person to jail, or do we want to have community-based mental health programs for everyone, because we all need assistance of various kinds at various times to keep anyone from getting to a crisis point. And those conversations are conversations, again, that you are leading here in LA, and I'm just so grateful for CR's constant and clear vision about that. And so ultimately, Visible No More hopefully brings us closer to building a world where these statements are not just demands or declarations or aspirations, but they're just the truth in which we live and the way in which we act and the things that we do every day to take care of, protect, love each other so that we can not all just survive but thrive. So thank you so much for your attention. I can't wait for this conversation.
Hello. Hi. Hi. Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to see a lot of familiar faces from other parts of the state, other folks that have been doing organizing here in Los Angeles for such a long time. I want to start off by thanking CR, thanking the space for this beautiful space, for allowing us to be here tonight. Andrea, thank you for your work, for your inspiration, for your diligence, and for telling the stories that need to be told. I want to start off also by letting everyone know that we're standing on Tonga land, and I want to allow a moment to honor the people of this land that were criminalized, that were caged, and that are still here. And I also want to introduce the amazing, fashionable, effortlessly gorgeous Romarilyn Ralston. Romarilyn is a Black feminist activist and scholar. For 3 decades, she has organized for gender and racial justice and against the violence of imprisonment. First, while incarcerated at the California Institute for Women, then as a student at Pitzer College through internships with Crossroads for Women in Claremont, Borrowed Voices in Aflaba Page Detention Center, and Prototypes in Pomona. Then later, as an advocate on the outside, working with the YWCA Early Childhood Center and Ferguson Commission in St. Louis, Missouri. Romarilyn is currently the program coordinator of Project Rebound at the California State University Fullerton, which provides formerly incarcerated students with tools and opportunities to help them thrive as scholars. She is also an organizer with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. Give it up for CCWP. A recent graduate of the Women's Foundation of California's Women's Policy Institute. Yes, WPI. And a graduate of Just Leadership USA's Leading with Conviction program and a 2014-2015 Coro Fellow in Public Affairs alumni. Whew, it's a mouthful. Yeah, let's clap for her. Romarilyn holds a BA with honors in gender and feminist studies from Pitzer College and an MA in liberal arts from Washington University in St. Louis, and received the 2018 Civil Rights Advocacy Award for the National Coalition of Black Women, Orange County Chapter. One more round for Romarilyn. And some of you may be wondering who I am. Sorry, I didn't give you details. I'm one of the statewide co-coordinators of Californians United for a Responsible Budget and part of the Justice LA Coalition. Awesome, so we'll kick off the conversation. As you were presenting, Andrea, I was struck by the power of narrative to both criminalize and cage our people, but also the power of telling our stories to reclaim that narrative. The images that you shared, the stories, the data that complements those narratives have the power to change our communities and are constantly changing our communities day in and day out. So thank you for that work. Romarilyn, can you speak to your reflections on Andrea's presentation as they pertain to storytelling, both to incarcerate and liberate our people?
Thank you, Ivette. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to see Andrea and to listen to me. This is so exciting to be here in this space. Thank you, Critical Resistance LA. I'm really honored to be invited. I really appreciate just being here with Andrea. She is not only a superstar, and the book Invisible No More is just incredible, and just like Danielle said, thank you so much for the labor and the love that you put in writing that book and sharing those stories with us. It's incredibly powerful and meaningful work, and I thank you for bringing it to the world. Thank you so much. So I'll just start by saying, fantastic presentation and a lot to really think about. The slides that you presented to show, the criminalization and the policing that happens within Black community, especially against Black women and women of color. As a Black woman, really gave me pause because, I reflected upon my life not only in St. Louis as a kid, but as a young woman coming to California in 1986. In the heyday of gangs and crack and all kinds of stuff, and how I got involved in that type of policing and criminalization because I was a young Black woman out in the streets of California. But what really struck me was that you said how the current administration uses criminalization as a major tool. Mm-hmm. And God forbid I am, stuck, but as soon as I get in the house at night, turn on MSNBC because I want to know what the current administration is talking about now, who they're talking about. And it's just that. To think about the policies and the laws on the books that continue to frame certain bodies in a way that sets us up for cages, for jails and prisons, just because we're wrapped in a certain hue or a certain tone or wear a certain hat or dress a certain way. It's all those kinds of things that we really should be concerned about in our communities, because when I look around this room, everyone's dressed differently. Haircuts are different. Everybody has a different type of swag. And any of these things could be the next thing that is criminalized. It could be green earrings, or glasses, or, who knows? And so, in just thinking about how who's ever in power has the liberty to say what's right and what's wrong, was really scary. It really gave me something to think about really deeply and critically that I hadn't thought about before until you just said it tonight. And then just the slides about the increase of the number of women who have been incarcerated. since the 80s, and seeing that slide as it progressed up, you know, to over 700%. Because we think about women in prison as being, you know, women period, as being invisible, you know. But I finally got it tonight. The title of your book, Invisible No More. I finally got it. You know, and I have 2 copies of your book, but I finally got it tonight. I'm like, oh my God. From 1 to, you know, 250,000, we're invisible no more, but yet we're still invisible. So it was just, you know, your presentation just really gave me something to think about in ways that I was pondering that, like, why hadn't I gotten it before? Because I see myself as a formerly incarcerated or previously incarcerated Black woman as invisible. And that's going to be my life, being invisible. And seeing how many women have gone through the cages over the years and decades, I said, wow, you know, we finally have your book, Sarah's book, that's Ritchie's book, you know, now the beautiful Emily Filma's book, to say that we are no longer invisible. So thank you so much for waking me up. I'm woke now, y'all. I'm woke. And then, you know, just the comparison, you know, of Black men. You know, 1 in 3 Black men in their lifetimes will go to prison. You know, 2 out of 3 trans women, Black trans women. 1 in 18 Black women. You know, and I'm one of those 1 in 18. It's just those numbers are so staggering. You know, you would think that there would be more scholarship, more activism, more stuff, you know, to get people's attention on these numbers. And this is just really great that you all came out to hear this information. So every time I hear those numbers, it bothers me and you know, gives me something more to strive to work on. And then there's so many things, but I'll just end with this. The reclaim, reimagine, and reinvest, the last piece. Because I think that's critical, that's so important, is that we get those correction dollars, we get the money out of the hands of law enforcement and the policies and practices that continue to marginalize and criminalize and cage people back into the hands of the community, where folks are getting their basic needs met at home so that they're not set up for the failure, and so that our Black girls can go to school and learn and thrive and not get pushed out because their hair is braided a certain way or they're sassy or whatever it is. So thank you so much for that. It's just some of my reflections. We can always talk later.
We're going to be talking for the next hour. I'm so grateful to you, Romarilyn, for those reflections, and just, I mean, I wrote the book for you and women like you, and so that's the review that I care most about. So I'm really grateful to you for that. And that, yeah, I mean, Invisible No More is like it's a declaration, but it's still an aspiration. And I feel like even in the way in which the book has been received, I mean, I feel like it's been well received in activist circles, and I'm really grateful for that. But in terms of mainstream, you know, I'm not on CNBC, I'm not on CNN or whatever. Like, it's not broken through the conversation around policing. The New York Times did a review. There were like 3 books about policing came out this year, and it was, you know, 2 called Police that had Policing Black Men in the title, and 1 written by a Black man who was the police chief of Dallas. And it was kind of like, you think you forgot one, but it's like literally, it's just invisible, even though it's purple, and it says invisible no more. So I feel like for women like you, I think that's the truth too, and I think that's particularly true in the context of gang policing. And I feel like I learned here in LA about how gang policing affects women directly, profiling-wise, how Latina, particularly gender non-conforming women, are profiled as gang members, and that's historical, actually, that there used to be like Latinas who wore zoot suits, who were like in zoot suit culture, would be profiled as gang members, and there's a whole piece of that, so that when I hear the current administration being like, we're going for gangs, there are many stories, unfortunately, that aren't in the book because they happen afterwards, of Latina women and black women being caught up in that because, yes, they wore a Chicago Bulls shirt, or because they were seen as a guy who was profiled as a gang member, or so on. And so I think that we need to look, the part of the book is like, look where we're already looking and we'll see women. And then look where we're not looking, like in policing and prostitution, where the rates of racial disparity are exactly the same as they are for stop and frisk. But one galvanizes a movement, and then one galvanizes a movement of sex workers, right? It needs to galvanize a larger movement. So, yeah, I think that, I feel like the gang policing piece is something that we really need to pay attention to in this moment, because what you're saying about the process of criminalization is, part of what I'm trying to get at the book is that all of it is normalized, right? And that some of us may have like exceptions, like non-serious, non-violent drug offenses, or, oh, we don't believe prostitution be criminalized, or homelessness, or whatever, but usually it becomes normalized for us at some point, right? Gangs, violent gangs, or sexual predators, or R. Kelly, right? At some point, we don't question the process of criminalization as a whole. And I think the idea and the hope is that the book would start us all thinking exactly what you just said, which is that actually they're all political decisions. Even criminalization of killing another human being is a political decision. Because when it's done by a drone strike in Yemen, it's not even considered a crime, it's considered an act of patriotism and actual security. Right? When it's done by a cop, it's considered automatically self-defense. When it's done by Leah, it's considered she didn't kill the guy, but when people self-defend, it's considered a crime. So I hope that we can get to that place, and I know that you're bringing us closer to that place with the work that you do every day. And I'm curious how this kind of conversation resonates with you in terms of this question of reinvesting and reimagining. I mean, when people say budget stuff, like my eyes roll back in my head. That's why I went back to law school. But ultimately, that's why that is what we need to be thinking about: is how do we allocate the resources of the commons? And I'm wondering how this conversation feeds into what we do.
Yeah, I love that you brought in the framework of reclaiming, reimagining, and reinvesting, because that was the driving force of Justice LA. Because for us, and I think from a lot of us in this room, it's not just about breaking down the cages. It's not just about stopping the policing. It's about building up the world that we want to see as well. Those resources, right? Which also contribute to the criminalization of people. If you do not have stable housing, that leads to more interaction with the police, actually 17 times the rate of interaction with the police when you're houseless or homeless here in Los Angeles. So we see the need for resources as complementary to our fight for abolition. And so often those resources that are being spent on incarceration, that are being spent on building jails, in the case of Los Angeles, $3.5 billion, could be going to all of those services we know we need. All of Los Angeles knows that we have a homelessness problem, right? And we have the resources. In fact, we're willing to take out loans, unsecured bonds to build jails, but we're not able to declare a state of emergency to funnel money to the people that need it now. We are in a state of emergency here in Los Angeles. And so those conversations are not divorced from each other. One thing that struck me when I was hearing you speak, Ro, was that those of us that are in the nitty-gritty of the work, that we know our research, we read the books, we're doing the day-to-day organizing, we can still be completely awestruck of the scope and the magnitude of the problem that we're engaging in. We constantly have these woke moments. And that statistic you put up around lesbian and bisexual women, that's a statistic I learned very recently. As a queer woman, I feel like I should have known this. And I was still awestruck by it. I had my moment of, whoa, like, holy crap, like this is huge. And so I'm wondering, in your research, Andrea, what were those moments of like, I'm feeling woke by my research right now?
So many times. I mean, that stat definitely was one that I was like, what? I think I learned a lot about criminalization of people with disabilities in the context of doing this book that I didn't know before, and just how, and also about criminalization of Indigenous people. I didn't know as much as I need to know about that. So for instance, I learned that Indigenous youth in places where there's concentrated Indigenous people, like Utah, are 4 times more likely to be arrested in K to 12, so kindergarten, than all other people, including Black people, right? And that often there's an element of disability in there, and that there was also some case in South Dakota where there were like Indigenous girls who had like federally approved disability learning programs, IEPs, so everybody, the administrators knew that they were disabled, but when they were defending themselves against bullying, anti-Indigenous bullying in the school, the principal would drag them in and make them sign confessions without their parents present, knowing that they were receiving, assistance with reading in school, and then use that to criminalize them. And I just was like, there's so many layers to what's happening there. So yeah, there were many moments. I think also I was excited always to learn about resistance I didn't know about before, and really looked for historical resistance and finding about Indigenous women who were kicking ass on the battlefield and resisting from the moment Columbus got here, or reading about how Black women resisted in slavery in all kinds of ways. Was really eye-opening. And the last thing I'll say is what really struck me is sometimes the police interactions that Sarah Gale was describing in her book that happened in 1888, you actually couldn't tell whether they happened in 1888 or 2018. And they were very similar to stories that I was reading about in contemporary forms. And so it just really rammed home for me how this process of criminalization just deems categories of people as criminal, and then they will be criminalized by whatever law. A Black code, a vagrancy code, a prostitution law, a broken windows law, a child welfare law. It's just going to be the same process, and that it's about controlling Black women's reproductive and economic labor, and punishing and maintaining white supremacy, and drawing the category of women in ways that exclude Black women. So I feel like the same with Cynthia Blair's book around policing and prostitution in Chicago in the turn of the century. It was like, oh, was that yesterday? Because I just heard that story yesterday. So, but also just reading about so many ways that people was eye-opening and inspiring.
Thank you so much. So you did a really great job in laying out the connection between policing and incarceration, both in jails and in prisons. Romarilyn, could you give us a snapshot of what imprisonment of Black women and women of color specifically looks like in California?
No.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, okay. Well, I think, Andrew's presentation and what she's been saying will really help to frame a lot of that context. But in your book, Invisible No More, you really talk about these sites of police contact, these points of police contact, like domestic violence situations. And as a woman who is a survivor of domestic abuse, calling the police to come over and to protect you, or to provide you with some type of solace or comfort, getting help, and to then further, abuse you, demean you, degrade you, take the side of the abuser. It's those things that continue to happen, currently continue to happen, will always continue to happen, unfortunately, unless we step in and have more community accountability to our law enforcement agents. It's those points of policing besides domestic violence, sex work, gender lines, disability. It's those things that I think we still have in California and across the country, where we need to really offer more support for women when we reach out for help. You know, we need to have someone who is watching the watchers so that there's protection against women. You say a snapshot of what imprisonment against Black women and women of color looks like. That's what it looks like. It looks like the police policing you for whatever reason that they want to, and holding you in jails for as long as they want and then releasing you. So, quick story, this hat came from Herman, who's part of Critical Resistance, and although he's not a Black woman, he is a brown man. And he designed this hat because he was policed and he's a school teacher. And so he was held in jail for 7 days and not released because they could. And that's the problem. You know, we empower our law enforcement agencies to protect us. We pay money, we pay their salary, and they don't protect us because we look a certain way or walk a certain way, or because we're a certain gender, or we're gender non-conforming, which we have the right to be all of those things. And so I think it's hard to say a snapshot because these issues are really big issues, and they've been around since, like you say. In Sarah Haley's book, she talks about the criminalization of Black women, you know, in Georgia since 1888, from, you know, emancipation to convict leasing to the chain gang. And now here we are with mass incarceration for the last 40 years, being caught up with women being the fastest growing population behind bars. So there's no snapshot. We're talking about a century, a century of what has been criminalization against Black women. And it's hard to kind of put into words how big this problem, how ongoing this problem has been, and how we can even, you know, start to dismantle it. So, but I do want to mention CCWP at this point because the work that we've been doing since 1995, I think has helped to slow down some of the process by bringing attention to the problem. And the problem is that once women are criminalized and incarcerated, you know, that they face a whole bunch of other issues while they're inside. You know, lack of medication, lack of food, proper clothing, the abuse and the violence that takes place within these cages is part of the problem. So that people are not getting well inside, they're actually getting worse inside. The sexual violence that happens to women inside has now come to the attention of lawmakers. You know, we have a campaign within CCWP, hashtag #MeToo Behind Bars, where we're trying to get folks inside as part of this movement because they deserve to have their stories told too. Their lives are real. Their trauma is real. We also have the Drop LWAP campaign that we'll be talking about a little later. So there's a lot of things that are going on to address the issues that women face once they become incarcerated.
I think that the two things that you're saying sparked a thought for me. One is that this wasn't necessarily something I became woke to while reading this book, but that I've been struck when I'm reading this book. Sometimes I use it. When I'm looking for information, I'm like, this is why I write books. I put everything I know in one place so I can find it, not 10 boxes in my apartment. But when I was writing what I've been researching over the years is how much of the violence against Black women and women of color and queer and trans people of color happens in the context of those moments of calls for assistance or where someone else called for assistance, right? Which is part of the reason it's invisible, because police are wilding out during DV calls, but there's no one there to cop watch that, right? There's no videotaping, it's not visible to the world, or police are sexually assaulting survivors of sexual violence during the investigation of the sexual assault. Like that, no one's watching that, right? Policing of prostitution happens, you know, and people, like the sexual violence happens in the back of a police car or at the police station. And And then calls for assistance with mental health crises are primary site also of police killings and police violence. One of the stories I told in the book that was so painful, among many painful stories, was one of a woman named Jasmine Ha-Eng, who was literally sitting in a mental health clinic where she'd come to get help. And they had called the cops to transport her to a facility because apparently no one else can transport you, which is something we need to change. And they told the cops that she was sitting quietly and was calm, and but they walked into the clinic and within minutes shot her. And so one, clinics are sites of police violence, but two, I couldn't even find a picture of her. I couldn't find any visual to represent that story tonight because it happened behind closed doors and no one was sort of cop watching or doing that. So I feel like the calls for assistance, the ways in which the same kind of criminalizing narratives that make up the octopus apply when cops are supposedly acting as protectors or as responding to calls for help, as happened when they're out in the street patrolling. And then the second thing was, policing happens also when you're in prison. Right? That one of the reasons that researchers think that the number of women keeps going up as the number of men or people incarcerated in prison goes down is in part because people in women's prison get more disciplinary tickets and longer discipline because they're being policed inside for compliance, right? And gender compliance inside. And then also because women are more, and trans and queer people are more likely to be violated by the probation and parole officers who are policing them when they come out. Right, and that there's also sexual extortion and violence that happens in that context as well, but just that there's constant racial gender policing that's happening at every stage, certainly at the front end to drive people in, but to keep people in and to put people back in.
And just before we move on, I just want to give some numbers out in this snapshot about California. So there's a little over 5,700 women who are incarcerated here in the state, and most of those women, of course, are women of color. A little over 3,200 of those women out of the 5,700 are women of color. So, we talk about all the time, we hear how black and brown men are disproportionately incarcerated, but so are black and brown women disproportionately incarcerated. And out of those groups, it's very interesting that the number one group is women the age between 30 and 34, and then the second most incarcerated group is between 25 and 29. And when you think about those age groups, these are, ages where women are in the prime of their lives. It's their childbearing years, it's their college years, they're getting their careers together, they're, experiencing life and supposed to be living their best life. But they're incarcerated during this time, which speaks to, who is allowed to have a life, who's allowed to have a child, who can be a mother, who can have a career, who can have, access to education. So it's policing and criminalization of these age groups that also, set up women of color, black women, to pretty much forfeit the best part of our lives.
Thank you for that context. One thing that struck me, Andrea, as you were presenting, is when you mentioned how criminalization is happening even within institutions that purport to help us. And that really speaks to the insidious nature of carceral feminism, carceral humanism, that's informing the current jail fight right now here in Los Angeles. Eva mentioned that we were able to stop the women's jail from being built, which is a huge victory. But the mental health jail was renamed as a mental health facility. It strikes me, given the context, not just here in California, but also nationally, that co-option of our narratives, of our movement, of our very words, is happening in real time. Just this morning, I was watching the DHS Secretary Kirsten Nielsen speaking about the cages on the border. And she said they're not cages, they're areas of the border facility that are carved out for the safety and protection of those who remain while they're being processed. We've heard similar descriptions about the mental health facility, and I would change being processed to being warehoused. The mental health facility is being touted as a place where people can heal, where our communities can receive the services they need. But we know that those services are best met by our communities in our communities. So let's talk specifically about mental health needs, decriminalization, non-state intervention, or community-based resources. Andrea, what are challenging solutions, not state fixes, the state is willing to concede when we fix for decriminalization of mental health needs and addressing harmful state violence and neglect? What do we need to be keen to?
Well, CR has taught me that we need to not just get rid of cages, but of everything that acts like a cage, looks like a cage, things that are produced based on the same values, and that we can't replace one carceral solution with something that is premised on the same values of punishment, exile, shame, and surveillance. And I mean, really, it's deeply taught me that. And so, for one, often people want to do crisis intervention training for police officers to make them into community-based mental health providers. And, you know, I tell a lot of stories, and I feel like I have one for every situation. I think Michelle Cusseau is a black lesbian in Arizona who was killed 3 or 4 days after Mike Brown was, by a police officer who was responding to a mental health call who had received CIC training. And similarly for Charlene Lyle, she was killed by police officers who had received CIT training. Cynthia Clements was killed in March by officers who had received CIT training. You're getting what the point I'm making, right? Is that it doesn't matter how much training you have, the minute you're confronted with someone who you internalize these criminalizing narratives about as deranged and out of control and violent and monstrous, then it doesn't matter what's actually happening in front of you. Cynthia Clements was stumbling out of a burning car, gasping for air. The officers were talking about needing to respond to her as someone whose mental health needs weren't being met seconds before that happened, and within seconds, they described her as grunting, and that she was grunting instead of gasping, and they shot her dead, right? And so it just shows to me the training can't overcome the controlling narratives that literally jump in front of the shield of view. So we're not going to do police officers and mental health professionals. That's a fix. That's not a fix, right? I think also we can't get carceral with our mental health alternatives or our public health based alternatives, right? And I've heard there was one moment when I was talking about the book in Atlanta that really has stayed with me. 2 young women came and they were telling their stories during the Q&A, and they said, you know, I've had mental health crises in public spaces, and when I'm taken in, sometimes I can't tell if I'm in the jail or the mental health hospital. They're like, you know, the blankets, I think, at one of them are a little bit thicker and the mattress a little more comfortable, but I can't really tell sometimes who's taking me in. And then I also watched a video online by someone who said that she'd been in the custody of handcuffs or Haldol for 30 years, right? So antipsychotic medication was just as carceral to her, and forced medication was just as carceral to her. So definitely, and then one of the things I did learn also was just the history of state mental hospitals. About the first state mental hospital for black folks was built to contain a black woman who had resisted enslavement by killing the children that she had so they wouldn't have to live in slavery, right? One of the ways Indigenous people were criminalized if they resisted the orders of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, for instance, to send their children away to be assimilated violently and tortured in Indian residential schools, was they would be sent to the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians, right? Basically, like, if you resist colonization, you are insane. And the degree and forms of torture that took place in those places continues to this day. They're prime sites of sexual violence. So the notion that a centralized mental health facility isn't going to look and feel like a prison and act like a prison, just with drugs and physical force by different people, is important. So I think that we really need to think about community-based mental health care, and that we need to think about it as something that is available to everyone at all times, in all forms, no matter what. If someone needs Olympia, then they need Olympia. Like, that should be covered by freaking universal health care, and we're done. Like, you know, like, people need what they need, and we have to do it from just as a part of everyday practice. It can't be that, you know, you have to go to this central hospital where you could be 5150 and locked up, and et cetera. There has to be sort of the practice of mental health that is universally covered by healthcare. So that's the solution that I would offer, and then it has to look like whatever someone needs it to look like. So we're not getting to a place where someone then is like being forced medicated. The last thing I'll say too is what I've learned from disability justice activists too is that we need to we need to honor people's dignity of risk and recognize that if someone doesn't want to take their medication, they don't want to take the medication. And they are entitled to take the risks that ensue from that. And that we need to find a way to hold them and care for them in the dignity of risk. And also ensure that we're holding the people around them so that they're not also experiencing harm in whatever form. And make sure that everybody has enough housing, food, clothing, income, financial support, etc., that everyone can hold that situation, respecting everyone's dignity and safety. So that's what I think is the real fix. I think mental health jail turned to mental health hospital is something that obviously you're going to continue to fight, and I'm grateful to you for that.
Yeah, oh, we will. Romarilyn, can you talk about what this looks like for Black women, women of color, gender non-conforming people in the state prison system that are in need of mental health support?
I love these questions. Thank you, Ivette. Thank you, Andrea, for, I was thinking about something when you said the risk. You know, folks should be able to decide for themselves if they want to take their medication or not, and that's something that should give them dignity. We shouldn't take that away from folks. So I just got to thinking about all the women who have been, arrested for taking care of themselves or protecting themselves from their abusers, who were then put in jail and then forced to take medication, because they had committed a violent crime. And so part of that punishment is that they put you on medication when you've already been traumatized. So you've been traumatized for years by an abuser. Now you've been arrested for protecting yourself from that abuser. And then the state then imposes medication on you. So they drug you. And then you're in a courtroom and you're trying to defend yourself, but you can't defend yourself because you've been drugged by the state. And then you're sent to prison and you're further medicated and then put into some of the most horrible conditions that exist. And then your mental health diagnosis is criminalized while you're inside. Especially for those survivors who are sentenced to life in prison or life without the possibility of parole. So it reduces your chances of being released if you have a mental health condition. They're not supposed to hold that against you, but they do. And so those who don't have the emotional support, the mental support, because there's no therapy available for folks who are incarcerated in most of the prisons throughout California. We self-care for one another. We talk each other through a lot of situations, and we have therapy among ourselves, but it's the medication that condemns us. And so the mental health issues that exist within prisons is just another way of criminalizing folks, especially if you're Black, trans, or a woman of color, or have any other, disability that may cause you to be different inside. The stigma of taking medication, from even incarcerated people standing in the med line. You're given a category You know, you're either a triple CMS or you were a JCAT before a triple CMS. So it's all of these labels that's placed on someone who has mental health issues. It makes it harder for you to get released. It makes it harder for you to do educational programs or participate in activities because you're on medication that you need, or medication that is supposed to help you manage your life better, which in some instances, when you're inside, that medication is withheld from you. You know, the Medline becomes an instrument, you know, a device, a mechanism for the state to continue to punish you. So it's those kinds of things that happen within the prison around mental health issues. And then those who have mental health issues and attempt suicide, you know, or then isolated in 4 concrete walls without any clothing, without any connection to a human being. The humiliation, the embarrassment, the shame, you know, they're cold, you know, folks are, and you talked about training, you know, the training that correction officers and sometimes police receive is training for their benefit, not for our benefit. And so, and then there's mocking on top of that. So it's all of these things compounded on top of each other that will break a person inside of a prison to cause them to harm themselves. So that's what it looks like inside of a prison if you're dealing with mental health issues. You know, you're dealing with mental health issues where you're over-medicated or under-medicated, misdiagnosed, taunted, mocked, you know, and sometimes encouraged to harm yourself by the very people that are supposed to be protecting you inside. So it's the same kind of stuff on the outside that happens in the inside. It's really quite sad. And so part of what, you know, CCWP's work has been over the last couple of years is addressing the suicide crisis within, you know, California prisons, especially the women's prisons. And it's hard work. You know, we've lost, you know, too many people to mental health issues and lack of correctional care. And they don't respond to the families, you know, in appropriate ways. People don't have the information that they need about their loved one inside. And so these are just all the things that happen within prison that we continue to need to do work around so that folks are going home to their communities and getting the care that they need from, like we say, folks in the community.
Yeah, speaking of...
Could I add one thing to that, which is that in addition to being denied medication, particularly for trans folks, you know, they'll force you on medication for depression, but deny you gender-affirming medication that would actually be the solution to, you know, that going off gender-affirming medication when you've been on it for a while causes mental health issues, and then they force you on medication for the mental health issues instead of just giving you the medication you need.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah, thank you for that. Speaking of resources in our community, we talked a little bit about the lack of access to medication, both inside and outside of cages. Let's talk about re-entry support for a minute. Justice LA has been advocating, like I mentioned, building up those resources within the community for re-entry services as well, for housing, for drug treatment, all the things we know actually keep us safe, and actively work to reclaim the narrative of public safety. That public safety really means investing in our communities and building up the health and wellness of our folks. And I love how you talked about wellness being what people need, right? What they need for themselves, the agency that should go hand in hand with those needs. Romarilyn, what do life-affirming and consensual re-entry resources look like? Can you give examples?
No, again. and I say that because I've seen no re-entry programs or transitional programs that have been really life-affirming. Well, what's life affirming for me when I was in transition was different from another woman. And so a lot of reentry programs are set up to address substance abuse issues, find employment, some kind of employment. But they're not life-affirming or consensual in the respect that during the intake assessment, that the person comes first. You know, that your reentry is about you, what your plan is for your life, what you want to do, not the program. Most reentry programs are extensions of the prison industrial complex. You know, a lot of transitional programs or reentry programs get their funding from the state. You know, and in order to get that money, they have to provide by certain rules and regulations. And that oftentimes set people up or set people back in their reentry process. So life affirming for me was education. That was life affirming for me. The program that I was in didn't have any educational programs. In fact, when I applied to college, it was said that I wouldn't get in. So that wasn't very life affirming. You know, a lot of women who are getting out who have served long sentences, 30, 40 years in prison, they may have had their sentences commuted from LWOP, or they just may have had a long sentence. A lot of facilities aren't equipped to handle the needs of an aging population. They aren't equipped to handle transgender issues, gender nonconforming issues. So when you say life affirming, it's about me, my life, what I want for it. That's the problem with reentry now, is that there's not enough reentry programs that folks returning back to the community can have a life affirming space. They're kind of all modeled behind this one type of idea that everyone coming out of prison needs to have substance abuse counseling, go to AA meetings, NA meetings, anger management. You know, those are kind of the staples of the reentry community. And we need to push back against that. We need to start reimagining reentry, because that's what sets people up for failure. It's being part of a program that doesn't acknowledge them and doesn't, because you're supposed to be free. The number one, I think, saying that folks in reentry programs feel is that they'll say to you, this feels like I'm still in prison. It feels like I'm still in jail. It feels like I'm locked up. These are the utterances that you hear from folks who are in reentry programs, because they're not life affirming. And you don't have any agency while you're there. You must do this and you must do that. And if you don't do those things, if you're not in by 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock, if you don't have a job in 30 days, if you don't do this and you don't do that, then back to prison you go. Or your parole or probation officer is called and you're threatened with a violation, or there's teachable moments or write-ups or some type of consequence to you not fulfilling whatever that thing was that you were supposed to do. So, you know, reentry is such a big problem, and it's not just for the long-termers getting out, it's for short-termers as well, because they're not really set up to address some of the short-term needs of folks who may have been homeless or houseless, who are still very early on in their addiction or their recovery. They don't have those kinds of supports for them. So reentry has a long way to go. And I think that should be our next point of focus, because a lot of folks, especially in California, recidivism is I think 54% in the state of California. And that's a high number. So the rate of return for folks, and to think about why, when most of them are just simple parole violations. It's not that folks are committing the crimes, it's that while they're in reentry, while they're in transition, that they're not getting the support that they need. They're not getting, that life-affirming thing to help them to be better. So they're getting violated and returned to custody because they violated some rule, whether it was on the probation side or it was on the program side.
Thank you for that context. The conditions of release that lead to that ellipses of incarceration is something that Justice Alé has really inserted in our pre-trial model as well, because those conditions can lead to someone incarcerated both as they re-enter and then before they're even convicted. The presumption of innocence is really not upheld through our current pretrial system. And when we think about who's most impacted here in Southern California, in the Inland Empire has the largest re-entry population. As we see the impacts of displacement here in Los Angeles, of gentrification, we're starting to see that creeping into the Inland Empire and affecting populations there as well.
Because you talked about warehousing. That's what jails and prisons are. They're warehouses. When cities and counties want to clean up the street, they incarcerate people. So when folks get out, they have no place to live. They go back inside. They clean up the streets that way. And it's a constant, vicious circle.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about how we've made strong strides against the legitimacy of women's prisons, stopped state expansion of both men and women's prisons in the 2000s with the work of a lot of CURB members, and recently defeated the proposed new women's jail. But the LA Men's Jail Replacement Project just passed as well, which we mentioned, and under the guise of a psych center, but designed as a jail. How can a Black feminist analysis and an analysis that centers state violence against women not leave men behind or implicitly legitimize the idea that cages for women and gender nonconforming people are bad, but legit and necessary for men?
Well, I have to say, I'm not a fan of this question. I hear the intention behind it. I think often I'm asked in my work, why are you erasing what's happening to men? I'm just like, oh my God. Or why are you making it about men and women? It's about everybody. And during there were 2 national days of action around policing of Black women and girls, and I heard from many organizers in different cities that men would come up and be like, how come there's only women's names on those signs? We need to put some men's names up there. And I was just like, really? Like, we are still invisible, and to raise the issue and experience of women doesn't make men's experiences invisible. It doesn't stop the dominant narrative. Most of the organizing, most of the resources, most of the money, most of the focus being on addressing men's incarceration. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, because numerically there's a larger number of people in cages in men's prisons. And just want to make sure that we're paying attention also to all men, right? We presume that they're not trans. We presume that they're not queer. We presume that they're not migrants. We presume a bunch of things about the incarcerated male population. But I feel like I need to say, and I know this isn't the intent of the question, but I need to say that telling these additional stories is completing the story. It's not a competing story, it's a completing story. And I feel frustrated sometimes when it's framed the other way. And then often, people are looking at me being like, why are you dividing the Black community? Okay, so I'm not trying to divide anybody, but I am trying to make sure that we don't. It's just, I feel like, it comes from it's also why I talk fast. 20 years of being in meetings where I would say, targeting Black and brown men, I'd be like, and women, and and just, if I wasn't in the meeting, it would just go back to the same language and we would just fall off the page. So I just feel like, I feel it's okay to be unapologetically uniquely, exclusively focused on Black women, girls, and transgender and non-conforming people because it's still an invisibility and there's still plenty of people who are unapologetically focused away from us. So that said, I do completely agree that we can't focus on, women shouldn't be in cages. The other thing I learned from CR very early on is like, we can't just make nicer cages for women, right? Like, we don't want gender responsive prisons. Like, oh, most of the people who are incarcerated in women's prisons are moms. Let's make prisons where they can have their babies with them. No! No cages, right? Same with trans prisons, right? People are like, oh, we need to create a trans pod to eliminate the violence. And, you struggle then, like, are we reducing harm or are we legitimizing the institution, right? So I do feel like there is this piece, and I think we also struggled with it when Sajid and I were litigating around sex offender registration of predominantly Black women for a charge in Louisiana, whether the way in which we were litigating that was reinforcing that it was okay for predatory men to be on a sex offender registry, that it was just a mistake for women to be on it, right? So I do feel like we need to tackle the issue that you're saying, which is, one, we don't want gender responsive or queer responsive or nicer cages, or we don't want to only eliminate LGBTQ detention when eliminate detention for everyone. And at the same time, not reinforce dichotomies of like good and bad, violent, not violent, felons, families. Like, I feel like those, or, men, women, along those same lines. Sorry, that's a garbled response to your question, but.
No, that's great. It's great to have that analysis of breaking down the binary while also uplifting the stories that have been historically erased, but erased no more.
Well, working on it. And I should just point people from the Black queer feminist point of view that you're asking about, back to the Combahee River collective statement, which makes it clear that a Black queer feminist lens is about all of our communities, and it's also about all allied communities. So it's about building across race, across gender, across nation, state. That's a Black queer feminist lens is actually a universal lens. It's not just for Black queer people.
Right on.
I'd just like to add, it's okay if we leave the men behind for a little while. It's all right. Yeah, it's all right. They don't have to be the center of our conversations all the time. The topics of our books, the centers of our universes. It's okay to leave them behind.
But we're not leaving them behind in the cages.
Well,
I think also.
Only the really bad ones. No. So you're right, but I'm just making light of it. But I really think that it's time for women to get their due, to get their turn, to have the attention placed on them, placed on us. It's time for the world to see us. We are invisible no more. It's time for that recognition that we need the support, we need the help, we need to be liberated, we need to have our children back, we need to be free, we need all of these things. And yes, we are different too. I think that needs to be acknowledged. We have different pathways into the carceral system. We do reentry different. We take care of ourselves inside differently. We build community differently in these. We are different. And it's time that we not be compared to men, but not treated like them either.
Exactly. And also, I just have to, clearly this question bothers me, or activates me, maybe, is the word I'm looking for. But, also, we've been not leaving men behind. We've been not leaving men behind at our own expense, right? Like, Black women been organizing around men's incarceration and supporting men who are incarcerated, people incarcerated in men's prisons. You need to read if you haven't already, the new SE Justice Project report that talks about how much Black women are not leaving Black men behind, even when they themselves are incarcerated. And so, and how many rallies, police brutality rallies, have we been to that were organized by Black women, staffed by Black women were on the mic talking about policing and police violence against their sons, their partners, their brothers, their fathers, and never once talking about their own experiences of policing, sometimes at that very rally or on their way there. And so I also just, I think I'm just really reacting to the notion that we're leaving them behind when we have been the primary motivators of the movement to end incarceration of people in men's prison and supporting people incarcerated in men's prison and being the reentry system for people in men's prison and caring for people, children of people in men's prison.
Now you're talking.
Like, no one's getting left behind here.
All of that. The only people getting left behind are the women in prison. Right. Because the men don't show up for us.
Absolutely.
You know, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Women are holding it down.
Holding it down.
We've been holding it down. I think this is a good place to end our conversation. Let's uplift some of the campaigns that CCWP is doing to hold down the women that are inside, connecting folks on the outside with women, and fighting the good fight towards abolition.
Awesome. So I just want to talk briefly about our Drop LWOP campaign. So LWOP is Life Without the Possibility of Parole. How many of you have heard of our Drop LWOP campaign? Awesome. So, and if you haven't heard, you're getting ready to. So currently in California, we have about 5,000 people throughout the prison system serving life without the possibility of parole. 201 of them are women and some transgendered folks. 90% of people serving LWOP were sentenced as aiders or abettors. You know, they weren't the primary perpetrator. They didn't kill anyone. They didn't commit the crime. They may have not even known that there was a crime being committed, and yet they're spending the rest of their lives in prison. So, thanks to the work of CCWP and Fuel Families United to eliminate LWOP, Life Without the Possibility of Parole, we're seeing more women come home. We've had about, I don't know, Kobe, how many people have we had come home? About 12 this year?
Well, 283 people, half of that, so 100.
Not the commutations, come home.
Come home.
For here to LA for CCWP members.
From LWOP?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's more like 3.
Oh, more like 3, not 12. I wanted to be 12. But anyway, yeah, with the commutations, there's a little over 200 people who have had their sentences commuted from LWOP. And, you know, I just think that, well, actually it says here, since 2012, former Governor Brown has commuted 51 people, 45% of whom were serving LWOP.
That's an old number, but yeah.
That's the old number on our fact sheet. Okay, all right. So anyway, thank you, Kobe. You know what? I refer to Kobe when it comes to Drop LWOP because she is doing a lot of the work for the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and going all up and down the state and to the prisons. If it wasn't for Kobe, then shout out to Kobe and of course all the other organizers who have been, who are here. CCWP, stand up.
Yes.
Don't be shy. Because it's not just the Drop LWOP campaign. CCWP was instrumental in getting attention of the state auditor, Senator Connie Leyva, to do that audit of the prisons around suicide. We were able to get SB 960 passed that Senator Leyva requires now the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to do an annual review of the prisons and report that information. So it's those campaigns. CCWP has also worked really hard last year to get other bills passed through the legislation. One was the indigent bill, raising the indigent threshold from $1. If you didn't know, folks who were incarcerated, if you had more than $1 on your trust account, you were not eligible for state supplies like hygiene products, soap, toothpaste, toothbrush, lotion, shampoo, conditioner, writing materials, stamps, envelopes. You did not get those things for free if you had more than $1 within a 30-day period. So we were able to get that raised to $25. So now 80,000 more people have access to what the state should already be providing, because your tax dollars provide that. And so we've been able to work on that. This year, we're working on eliminating co-pays. So that $5 charge to incarcerated folks who request a medical visit or a dental visit, we were able to get CDCR to submit a memo that became effective March 1st, eliminating co-pays throughout the prison system. We're still working on legislation that will also eliminate co-pays in the jail system. So there's a lot more work to be done. Also, some work around felony murder last year with 1437 that got passed. So there's lots of campaigns that CCWP has been working on, and we will continue to do the work until there's no more prisons. You know, that's our belief. And I'll just wrap up with saying a little bit more about some of our fantastic volunteers that are sitting over here in the audience. We need you to join us. We need more volunteers like Emily and Deirdre and Sarah and Molly and Brian and who else out there?
Christina.
And Christina. Where you at, Christina? All right, way back there in the back. Okay, and so if it wasn't for volunteers like them, and I want to call out Deirdre Wilson here, who I served time with at CIW, who got out and started doing the organizing work and came to visit me in prison. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for folks like you getting involved in this work, if it wasn't for organizations like Critical Resistance, you know, doing the work to abolish prisons, bringing the attention to what's happening within these cages, you know, just standing up for us when we can't stand up for ourselves, for raising the veil to say that we are not invisible, that we're not locked away in these places and no one cares about us, that you care and that you want us home. So thank you, Kobe and Deirdre and all of CCWP and all of you and CR and all of you for the work that you do for those of us who have gone to prison and those who are still in prison that need you. Thanks so much.
A huge thank you to Andrea Ritchie, to Ralston.
I just want to add to the list of campaigns to support Decrim New York, Decrim DC are trying to decriminalize prostitution, one of the primary pathways. Any No New Jails campaign, support that. Take your fight and your successes nationally. Atlanta is trying to close a jail. Detroit's trying to close a jail. People are closing jails everywhere. They're following your example. Support them back. Decrim everything. And then also support the National Mama's Day Bailout. Go to nationalbailout.org, support it. We need literally to get people out. Many people, when I say, have you ever heard, like what's the first name that comes to mind when I say police violence against black women? They say Sandra Bland. Well, we need to bail out the Sandra Blands and all the black women who are dying in jails or losing custody of their kids or suffering sexual assault or rape or health conditions in prison and or in jails and in immigration detention. So go to nationalbailout.org. And then also support campaigns like No Cop Academy. See the sign over there. This is my No Cop Academy graffiti shirt. That is a group of youth in Chicago who are saying we do not want $95 million invested in the police academy. We want $95 million invested in what our community wants. And P.S. we went out and talked to our community, and we have a report with like hundreds of things our community actually would like instead of a $95 million police academy. So support campaigns like that, support the movement for Black Lives, doing invest, divest work everywhere, and just like I said, before you leave, go to freelia.org. Tell government, DM, PM, tweet at, fax, I don't know, send a carrier pigeon, but make Governor Newsom free Leah, and every other criminalized survivor. Now, how many of you learned something tonight? Great, take your wallets out. How many have learned something from critical resistance over the years? Yeah, get those wallets out. How many of you use resources like this as your guiding light every single day? Like every day I'm doing police reform work, I'm like, wait, am I in the red or am I in the green? Is getting a police sexual violence policy in the red or in the green? Oh, it's in the red. I need to, it's actually kind of in between. Oh, I need to be careful. I need to check with my folks. I need to check with myself. How many of you use this every day to guide you in the work that you're doing? All right, get your wallets out. How many of you enjoyed the food tonight? Get your wallets out.
You know the food was good. If nothing else resonated with you, get your wallets out.
So I'm really going to invite you all to join me in making an investment in an organization that was abolitionist before it was cool. That was abolitionist before Jay said he was abolitionist. It was abolitionist before, I know, he's still not cool. It's still not cool, but it's cooler. And we need in this moment, in this political time, particularly to invest in people who are putting out bold visions that are about liberation, not about just holding ground or what can we win in this moment, but who are saying, no, this is what we need to get free. This is what we need to be, all of us to be free. And that's what critical resistance nationally and in LA has been doing for the past decades. So I had the privilege of speaking at Scripps College the other night. I am donating half of the honorarium that I received at Scripps College to Critical Resistance LA, not because I'm balling like that, I'm hustling like everybody else to pay the bills, but because I believe and value the work of CR. So I know y'all paid to get in here, but can you give it up? Again, maybe you were considering going out for a beverage this weekend. Put it in the basket. Maybe you were going to go and have a nice meal this weekend. You can do that later, put it in the basket. Maybe you were going to buy a new book. Well, buy Sarah Haley's book if you didn't get that message. But then put the rest that you were going to spend on books in the basket. Or you can buy the Invisible No More book because half the profit for that goes to CRLA. So if you were moved by anything Romarilyn and Ralston said tonight, put money in the basket. Because she just told you how important CR was to her and other survivors. If you're planning a little trip, maybe make it a little bit less luxe and put some money in the basket. But really, we have to invest, we have to support, we have to build organizations like CR that are going to lead us to freedom. So thank you so much, all of you, for being out here tonight. Thanks for putting money in the basket. Maybe dig a little deeper on your way out the door. Just drop a little bit more in on your way out, and encourage your friends to do that online to really honor and lift up the tremendous work of stopping two jails and all the other work that's been done over the years by CR and its allies. So thank you so much for joining us tonight to lift up and honor and celebrate that history.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for supporting Critical Resistance tonight and the great work that they're doing. If you want to get a copy of Andrea's book, a signed copy, straight in the back, there's a table where she will be signing some copies. And if you want to hear more and learn more about the jail fight here in Los Angeles, tomorrow at Chico's Justice Center, join us for Curbs Face to Face and Saturday. Thank you everyone.